Rosalind Hartley had learned, over 28 years, that a woman who expected nothing could not be disappointed, and so she had made a quiet art of expecting nothing at all. On the morning the great man was to come to Wrenmoor, she did not stand at the glass and pin her hair into hopeful curls. She put on the faded dove grey pelisse, the one worn soft at the cuffs and turned once at the hem, and she braided her dark hair into a low, unadorned knot, and she went out into the cold to the mews behind the great house to see that the falcon was fed, because no one else at Rosalind would remember to do it before the morning was half spent. The house was not hers. Nothing at Rosalind was hers. She was the poor cousin, the companion, the useful grey shape that carried the shawls and read to the dowager and was thanked by no one, and she had long since stopped waiting to be thanked. What she did not know, as she crossed the frost-silvered yard with her breath misting in the grey air, was that before the day was out she would say 6 words to the coldest duke in England, and walk out of his house with her coat over her arm, and that the walking out would be the truest thing she had ever done, and would change 2 frozen lives that had each, in their separate winters, given up on being changed at all. The mews at Rosmoor was the one place Rosalind was ever truly alone, and she loved it for that. It smelled of cold stone and old leather and the faint wildness of the bird, and the bird itself sat hooded and still on its block, a great white gerfalcon with barred wings the color of a winter sky, brought back from the north by the family's dead son, and kept now by no one, fed by no one, forgotten by everyone but her. They said it could not be handled. They said it had put its talons through the falconer's glove to the bone and taken the tip off a stable boy's finger, and that it ought by rights to be destroyed, and that the only reason it had not been was that no one could get near enough to do it. Rosalind slipped its hood with steady fingers and stood quiet while it turned its fierce gold eye upon her, and she did not flinch, and she did not reach, and after a moment the bird settled its feathers with a small dry rustle and looked away, which was as much welcome as it gave to anything living. "Good morning to you too," she said softly, and set down the meat and watched it feed, and let herself, for one quiet moment, be at peace. She had known the great man was coming for a fortnight. The dowager, Lady Rosmoor, had spoken of nothing else, for the Duke of Ashcombe, cold and rich and terrible, held the mortgage upon half the county and the whole of Rosmoor besides, and if he chose to call in the debt, the family would be turned out of the only house they had. So he was to be flattered. He was to be courted. He was to be shown, over a grand cold dinner, that the Wrenmoors were still people of consequence worth a duke's forbearance, and the whole household had been turned upside down in the shaking out of it. Rosalind's part in the business had been made plain to her from the first. She was to be invisible. She was to see that the silver was counted and the candles trimmed and the dowager's medicines measured, and then she was to keep to the edges of the room and not be seen. For a poor grey cousin at the table did the family's dignity no good at all. "You will make yourself useful," the dowager had said, "and you will not put yourself forward. And above all, you will not speak to his grace unless he speaks first to you, which he will not, for a man like that does not see women like you." Rosalind had said, quietly, that she understood. she had understood it all her life. She had come to Wrenmoor 5 years before, an orphan of a good name and no fortune, taken in, as the dowager never tired of reminding her, out of pure Christian charity, and set at once to the work of earning her bread in the only coin she had, her hands, her patience, her endless small usefulness. She kept the household accounts the steward was too idle to keep. She sat the long nights with the dowager when the old woman's chest was bad, and no one else would lose their sleep for it. She wrote the letters, and mended the linen, and walked the moor in all weathers on errands the family would not stir themselves to run. And she did it without complaint, not because she did not feel the injustice of it, but because she had learned, young and hard, that complaint changed nothing, and only gave the cruel a fresh place to press. So she had folded her wants up small, and put them away, and built her life instead out of the small solid things that could still be relied upon. The falcon to be fed, the accounts to be balanced, the moor at dawn, the 1 hour of quiet before the house woke. A woman could stand a great deal, she had found, if she only kept her hands busy and her spine straight, and did not let herself imagine, ever, a life in which she had been wanted for herself. The falcon had come to Wrenmoor 11 years before, in the arms of the family's only son, a laughing, reckless boy named Edmund, who had gone north to the falconers of the fells, and come back with a white gerfalcon on his wrist, and no thought at all of how a wild thing was to be kept once the novelty of it had worn thin. Edmund had died of a fall from a horse 2 winters later, 23, and mourned by everyone, and the bird had passed from hand to hand about the household like an unwanted debt, too dangerous to handle, too fierce to sell, too much a piece of the dead boy to destroy, until at last it had been shut up in the far mews, and left to the care of no one at all. Rosalind had found it in her first cold week at Rosalind, half-starved and murderous on its neglected block, and something in the sight of it had gone straight to the quick of her, a creature of the north, brought south against its will into a house that had no use for it, kept alive by charity, and thanked for nothing, too proud to die, and too wild to pretend. She had begun to feed it, because no one else would. She had learned its moods and its silences over 5 slow years the way she learned everything, patiently, asking nothing, and it had never once let her touch it, and had never once put its talons to her either. And that wary truce between the 2 most unwanted creatures at Wrenmoor was, though she would not have said so aloud, the nearest thing to friendship she owned. Her cousin Gerald had come down from London a week before the Duke, and that was its own weather to be endured. Gerald Wrenmoor was the heir, the dowager's grandson, a smooth, well-dressed young man with soft hands and a hard eye, who had spent the family into its present ruin at the London card tables, and come home now to see what might yet be salvaged. He had a scheme, Rosalind soon understood, though he was too clever to speak it plainly. If the Duke of Ashcombe could be brought to look kindly on the family, and better yet on a pretty Wrenmoor daughter or a profitable connection, the debt might be forgiven, and the house saved, and Gerald's inheritance with it. And Rosalind, the poor grey cousin who knew where every shilling had gone and kept the ledgers that proved it, was to Gerald a small, persistent inconvenience, a witness he would rather have gone. "You do well to make yourself scarce while his grace is here, Cos," he had told her lightly, over the ruin of a breakfast. A shabby dependent at the table reflects poorly on us all. No one wants to be reminded of the family's little economies. Rosalind had looked at him steadily and said she was well used to being scarce. And Gerald had smiled his smooth smile and thought he had won something, and had not understood that a woman does not need to be told twice where she is not wanted. The Duke of Ashcombe arrived at Rhenmoor as the light was failing, in a great black travelling coach on the mile-long moor road, and the whole household assembled in the cold entrance hall to receive him as though a king had come. Rosalind stood at the very back, in the shadow beneath the stairs, holding the dowager's second shawl in case the first should not be warm enough, exactly where she had been told to stand. And so it was from the shadows that she first saw Julian Rourke, Duke of Ashcombe, a tall, severe, aristocratic man of 35, dark-haired, sharp-featured, with eyes the pale grey of a frozen sky and a stillness about him that was not calm, but something colder, something held. He came into the hall and gave it one flat glance, and it was the glance of a man who had long ago stopped expecting to find anything in a room worth the trouble of looking twice. He bowed to the dowager with cold, perfect courtesy. He suffered the introductions of Gerald and the flustered cousins. He said as little as a man could say and still be counted civil, and all the while his winter eyes moved over the assembled Wrenmoors with a weary contempt he did not trouble to hide, weighing them, pricing them, finding them exactly as small and grasping as he had expected. He did not see Rosalind at all. She had not expected him to. Julian Rourke had not wanted to come to Rhenmoor, and he did not want to be there now. He had come because his man of business had put the papers before him and said the debt must be settled one way or the other, and because it was easier to look a debtor in the eye than to read 100 begging letters, and because there was, if he was honest, a cold black pleasure in it, in being the one man in a room who owed nothing and could be moved by nothing, in watching the desperate perform their little dances of flattery and knowing that no dance would reach him. He had learned to be that man 5 years ago, and he had made himself very good at it. He had loved once. He did not think of it. He had built a wall around the thinking of it so high and so smooth that whole months passed now without a crack, and he intended to keep it so. And if the cost of keeping it was that he moved through the world like a cold stone through cold water, touching nothing and touched by nothing, then that was a price he had long ago agreed to pay. He had come north to look at his debtors and settle a piece of business and go home again to his silence, and he expected, as he expected of everything, that it would move him not at all. The dinner was a cold, splendid failure, though only Rosalind, watching from her place near the wall where a companion might be needed and never noticed, seemed to see it for what it was. The dowager flattered too hard and too long. Gerald was too smooth by half, and let slip twice, a knowledge of horses and cards that a prudent man would have hidden from the very creditor he meant to soften. The pretty cousins laughed at the Duke's rare dry remarks, a half-beat too eagerly, and leaned and angled and made themselves bright, and the Duke watched them do it with the flat patience of a man watching rain fall on a window. And through it all Rosalind moved quietly at the edges, refilling the dowager's glass with the medicine she was meant to have, and not the wine she wanted, catching a footman's eye to mend a botched course, setting straight with 2 soft words a moment, when Gerald's tongue ran ahead of his sense, keeping the whole precarious evening from collapsing into the disaster it deserved to be. And no one at that table noticed she was doing it, least of all the cold grey man at its head who missed, as a rule, very little. It was after the covers were drawn, when the wine had gone round and the family had grown incautious with it, that the thing happened which the whole evening had been quietly building toward. The talk had turned, as such talk does among people who wish to seem grander than they are, to the difficulty of finding good and faithful people to serve one, and the dowager, warm with wine and want, made the mistake of gesturing at Rosalind where she stood by the wall. "Now there," she said, "is a case in point. Your Grace, my husband's cousin's girl, an orphan, taken in out of charity, and I will say she has made herself tolerably useful about the place. Plain as a post, and no fortune to speak of course. So we shall never be rid of her by marrying her off. But she reads well enough and keeps the accounts and does not eat a great deal, and one must be charitable." And she laughed, pleased with herself, and Gerald laughed, and the pretty cousins laughed, and Rosalind stood very still against the cold wall and felt the old familiar burn move up her throat and kept her face, as she had trained herself to keep it, perfectly composed. The Duke of Ashcombe turned his winter eyes upon her for the first time that night. He looked at her the way he looked at everything, coldly, briefly, pricing her. The grey pelisse, the plain knot of hair, the folded hands, the whole quiet, unremarkable shape of her. And perhaps it was the wine, or the tedium, or the long cold habit of a man who had made cruelty into a kind of armour and forgotten it could still cut. But he said, in that flat, carrying, aristocratic voice that filled the whole cold room without seeming to try, "You need not trouble yourself to be charitable, madam. Women like her are common as grey days in this country. Should this one weary you, you have only to open the door, and the wind will blow you in 100 more exactly like her before the week is out." And he turned back to his wine, dismissing her, dismissing the whole small matter of her, as a man flicks ash from his sleeve. 100 more exactly like her. The words fell into the warm, bright room, and something in Rosalind Hartley went very quiet and very clear, the way the moor goes quiet and clear in the last still moment before a storm. She had been called plain 1,000 times. She had been called useless and shabby and a burden and grey, and had let it all pass through her and find nothing to wound. But no one had ever, in 28 years, said aloud and to her face that she was nothing, not merely plain, but interchangeable, a grey day among grey days, a thing so wholly without particular worth that 100 more of her might be got for the asking. And she found, standing there in the shadow of the stairs, that she believed him. That was the terrible part. For one long cold moment she believed him entirely, felt the whole weight of 5 years and 28 years press down and agree with him, felt the old lie she had lived by, expect nothing, be nothing, want nothing, reach up and close its hand around her heart and whisper, "Yes, that is exactly what you are, and always have been, and always will be." That was the darkest moment of it, not the cruelty. The instant the cruelty sounded like the truth. And then, quietly from somewhere she had not known she still owned, something in her refused it. She thought of the falcon that let no one near, that had taken a man's finger and would take another's, and that turned its fierce gold eye on her each cold morning, and settled its feathers, and let her stand, she thought. That bird is not one of 100. That bird is the only one of its kind in the whole Grey County, and it chose to let me near it, and it asks nothing of anyone, and it would sooner die on its block than pretend to be tame for the comfort of small people. And she thought, with a strange rising calm, I would sooner be that. I have spent 5 years making myself small enough to be born, and it has not bought me one kind word. And I am tired, I am so very tired, of being small in this house. If I am to be nothing to them, let me at least be nothing on my own 2 feet, and out in the honest cold, and not one moment longer against this wall. If Rosalind's story has drawn you in this far, then subscribe now, because what she does next, in the next long, cold moment, is the thing this whole tale turns upon, and what it costs her and what it wins her is the part I have been waiting to tell you. Stay with her. She is about to do the bravest small thing a woman in her place can do, and the coldest man in England is about to learn, too late and to his lasting cost, exactly what he flicked from his sleeve. There is a door in a cold stone hall, and a coat over a plain grey arm, and I do not want you to miss what walks through it. She did not weep. She did not answer, though 100 answers rose in her, and she let every one of them go, for she had learned that the cruel are strengthened by a reply, and starved by silence. She did not curtsy either, which the dowager marked and would speak of later. She simply moved, quietly, steadily, without haste, away from the wall where she had been placed, and toward the door where the servants had hung the guests' outer things, and she took down from the peg her own plain grey coat, the worn one, the only warm thing she owned, and she drew it over her arm, and she walked the length of that bright, cold room, past the whole staring assembled family and the cold grey Duke at its head, and at the door she stopped and turned and looked at Julian Rourke directly for the first and, she supposed, the last time in her life. "You are quite right, Your Grace," she said, in a voice low and steady and utterly without fear. "There is nothing here worth a great man's trouble." And she opened the door, and let the honest cold wind of the moor come pouring into that warm false room, and she walked out into it, and did not once look back. The silence she left behind her was the loudest thing that had happened at Wrenmoor in 5 years. The dowager sat with her mouth open. Gerald half rose, torn between chasing the scandal down and the greater urgency of not offending the Duke, and did neither, and sat down again looking foolish. The pretty cousins glanced at one another and did not dare to laugh. And Julian Rourke, Duke of Ashcombe, sat very still at the head of the table with his cold wine untouched before him, and found, to his own considerable surprise, that he could not for the life of him look away from the door that had closed behind her. Something had happened that had not happened to him in a great many years. Someone had refused him, not begged of him, not flattered him, not schemed at him, refused him quietly and completely, and taken her coat, and walked out into the cold rather than stand one moment longer to be counted among 100 grey days. And the words she had left in the room, "There is nothing here worth a great man's trouble," hung in the warm false air, and turned, slowly, from an insult flung back at him into a thing he was very much afraid might be exactly, unbearably true. Outside, the moor took Rosalind in as it always had, cold and grey and indifferent and clean, She walked without knowing where she walked, out past the mews and the frozen park, and onto the open fell where the wind could reach her, and she pulled her plain grey coat close, and let the cold scour the burning from her face, and only when she was well away from the house, well out of any hearing, did she let herself shake. Not with weeping, but with the enormous unfamiliar tremor of a person who has, for the first time in a very long life of not doing so, stood up. She had no plan. She had nowhere to go. She was a penniless orphan who had just insulted a duke and quit the only roof she had, and by every measure of the sensible world she had ruined herself. And yet, standing on the black fell under a sky full of hard white stars, with her breath smoking and her heart pounding, Rosalind Hartley felt something she had not felt in 5 years, and could not at first even name. And finally, laughing a little, wildly into the wind, recognized. She felt free. She felt, for the first time since she had come to Wrenmoor, entirely and only herself, and she found she would not have traded the feeling for a warm room and 100 years of grey safety. She did not go far. There was nowhere to go. That was the plain arithmetic of it, and Rosalind had never been one to lie to herself about arithmetic. But she could not go back into that room, and so she went instead where she always went when the house grew unbearable, to the mews and the falcon, the one creature at Rosmoor as unwanted and as unbroken as herself. She let herself in out of the wind and stood in the cold dark that smelled of stone and leather, and the great white bird stirred on its block and turned its fierce gold eye upon her, and did not startle, and did not cry out, and after a moment settled its barred wings with that small, dry, familiar rustle, as if to say so, "You have come at last to where you belong." "They would get 100 more of me," he says, Rosalind told the bird very quietly, and her voice only shook a little. "And 100 more of you, I suppose, if they opened the door. But it is not true, is it? There has only ever been one of you in all the world. I think perhaps there has only ever been one of me." And the falcon looked at her with its ancient golden eye and said nothing, which was, from the falcon, a very great deal. She meant to be gone by morning. She had turned it over through the cold hours and decided she would take her few things and the little money she had saved out of nothing over 5 years, and she would walk the 15 miles to the market town before the house woke, and take the carrier's cart from there to wherever it went, and offer herself as a governess or a companion or a shopkeeper's drudge, anything, anywhere, so long as it was not a place where she had once agreed to be nothing. It was a poor plan, and a frightening one, and she knew it. But at first light, when she came out to the frozen yard with her small bundle in her hand, and her heart high in her throat, she found that the moor had a different morning in store for her, for the Duke of Ashcombe's great black coach still stood in the yard, its horses not put to, and the Duke of Ashcombe himself stood beside it in the grey dawn, plainly dressed and plainly waiting, and he had been waiting, by the look of the frost on his coat, some considerable time. "Miss Hartley," he said. Just that. She had not known he had troubled to learn her name. She was fairly sure the dowager had never spoken it. She stopped in the middle of the frozen yard with her bundle in her hand, and she did not curtsy, and she did not lower her eyes, for she had left all of that behind her in the warm false room the night before, and did not mean to pick it up again. "Your Grace," she said, "if you have come to be certain the wind has blown me away and spared you the 100 more, You may set your mind at rest. I am going." And she made to walk on, past him, out of the gate and onto the moor road, and out of his cold life entirely. But the Duke of Ashcombe said, in a voice she had not heard from him before, low and rough, and stripped of all its winter, "No, I have come to ask your pardon, and I find I do not know how, for I am very badly out of the practice of it, and so you will have to bear with me while I make a poor job of a thing I have not done in 5 years." Rosalind stopped. She turned. She looked at him standing there in the grey light with the frost on his coat, and no coldness at all now in the pale eyes, only something raw and startled and almost afraid, and she found she did not know what to do with it, for she had armoured herself against his cruelty, and had no armour at all against this. "I said a thing last night," Julian Rourke went on, with difficulty, as a man crosses ice, "that I have said, in one form or another, to 100 rooms full of people over 5 years, and never once been sorry for, because I taught myself long ago that the surest way to be untouched is to touch nothing, and the surest way to be moved by no one is to make certain no one is worth the moving. I called you common. I said 100 more like you might be had for the asking. And you took your coat, and you told me there was nothing in that room worth my trouble. And you walked out. And Miss Hartley, I have sat the whole night in that cold room since, and I find I cannot make it untrue. There was nothing in that room worth my trouble. You were the only thing in it that was, and I saw it only in the moment you left." He had not meant to say so much. She could see that he had not. The words seemed to cost him, to be dragged up over the high, smooth wall he had built, and to surprise him as much as they surprised her by coming out at all. "Why," she said at last, quietly, "should the Duke of Ashcombe care one straw what a plain grey nobody thinks of him? You have the whole county in your debt. You could turn the Wrenmoors into the road tomorrow, and me with them, and never think of it again. Why stand in the cold since midnight to tell a companion you are sorry?" And Julian Rourke was quiet a long moment, the frost creaking under his boot as he shifted his weight, and then he said the truest thing he had said to another living soul in 5 years. "Because you did the one thing," he said, "that I have not had the courage to do in all that time. You stood up, and you told the truth, and you walked out of a room full of people who were pretending, into the cold, alone, with nothing, rather than agree for one moment more to be less than you are. I have wanted to walk out of my own life exactly so for 5 years, Miss Hartley, and I have never dared. And when I watched you do it, something in me that I thought was dead these 5 years turned over in its grave and woke." Rosalind set down her bundle in the frost. She did not entirely know why, only that this cold, grand, terrible man had said a thing to her honestly that no one had ever said, and that honesty was owed an answer. "You are not what I took you for last night," she said slowly. "I took you for cold all the way through. But a man who is cold all the way through does not stand in the frost since midnight over a thing he said to a nobody. He was cold on top of something once warm, I think, and the cold is only the ice that formed over it." She saw the words land, saw the pale eyes flinch as though she had touched a wound, which she had. "Whom did you lose?" she asked, gently, for she had learned long ago that grief, like a wary animal, is best not reached for, but simply stood near, quietly, until it decides for itself whether to come. And Julian Rourke, who had not spoken the name aloud in 5 years, looked out over the grey moor at the coming light and said, at last her name was Cecily. She was my wife. She died in a spring 3 days after she took a chill that should have been nothing, and I stood in the wet churchyard and I made myself a promise that I would never again love a thing the world could take from me. And I have kept it, Miss Hartley. God help me, I have kept it very well, until last night, when a grey woman I had insulted took her coat and walked out of my reach, and I understood, standing in that cold room, that I have not kept myself safe these 5 years. I have only kept myself dead. They stood a long while in the frozen yard, the two of them, and something passed between them in the grey light that neither had a name for, and both were too honest to pretend away. She did not fall into forgiving him easily. That was not her way. And he would learn, over the long good years to come, that it was one of the things he prized most in her, that her regard, once she gave it, had been earned and weighed and meant, and was worth the more for never being cheap, and he did not press her. He had done enough pressing of the world in his 5 cold years. He found he did not wish to press her at all. He only said, when the silence had gone as far as it could, I will not ask you to go back into that house. I would not ask any creature I respected to go back into that house, and I respect you more than anyone I have met in 5 years, which I am aware is a poor and belated compliment, and I offer it anyway. But the cart to the market town does not come until noon, and it is bitter, and there is a fire in the inn at the crossroads and a private parlour, and I find, Miss Hartley, I find I am not ready for you to walk out of my reach a second time. Will you take breakfast with a cold man who is trying, very clumsily, to remember how to be warm? And Rosalind Hartley, who had walked out of Wrenmoor with nothing but a coat and her own 2 feet and the whole of herself intact for the first time in 5 years, looked at the Duke of Ashcombe a long, steady moment. And then she picked up her bundle, and she said, I will take breakfast with you, Your Grace. But not because you are a duke, and not to be saved. For I have just discovered I would rather save myself. I will take breakfast with you because you stood in the frost since midnight to tell a nobody the truth. And a man who will do that is worth an hour of anyone's morning. And the ghost of something that had once been a smile moved across Julian Rourke's cold face, the first in 5 years, and he handed her up into the great black coach as though she were the Duchess of the whole grey county, and the frozen yard of Rosalind watched them go, and the falcon on its block turned its fierce gold eye to the mews door and settled its wings, and waited. They did not marry in a week, nor in a month. That was not the shape of it, and Rosalind would not have had it so. She had spent 5 years being disposed of by the convenience of others, and she did not mean to be disposed of again, even into happiness, even by a man who was beginning, slowly and clumsily, to matter to her more than she had let anything matter in a very long time. So she did a thing that scandalized the whole county, and suited her exactly. She took a small position she found for herself, companion to a kind half-blind old widow in the market town, 3 rooms and a coal fire and her own front door, and wages she had earned, and no one to call her a charity or a burden ever again. And she let the Duke of Ashcombe court her from that small honest place. on her own ground, as an equal, or as near an equal as a duke and a companion could contrive to stand. He came often. He came at first on the flimsiest of pretexts, and then on no pretext at all, only riding the 10 miles from Ashcombe through the winter weather to sit in the widow's small warm parlour and talk to Rosalind about everything and nothing, the moor and the market and the books she read, and the great cold house he was learning, at long last, to open the shutters of. And every visit the ice went a little further out of him, and every visit she found the cold, grand, terrible man of that first night had been, all along, a lonely and honourable one frozen half to death. And she was not sorry, in the end, that she had walked out, for it was the walking out that had cracked them both open, and let the thaw begin. She learned him slowly, the way she learned all wary things. She learned that the coldness was a discipline he had taught himself, and not a nature he was born to, and that it cost him still to hold it, that under the winter manner was a man who had once written bad, hopeful poetry, and kept a dog that slept on his bed and laughed too loud at his own jokes, and had killed all of that off deliberately, one hard year at a time, because a man who feels nothing cannot be broken by a spring churchyard twice. She learned that he had not opened the east wing of Ashcombe in 5 years because it had been Cecily's, and that the servants tiptoed round his silences, and that the whole great house had frozen solid in sympathy with its master. And she learned, watching him thaw by inches in the widow's warm parlour, that grief is not cured by being told to cheer, nor by being reasoned with, nor by any of the brisk, unkind medicines the world prescribes for it, but only sometimes by the simple unlooked-for grace of being sat beside, quietly, by someone who asks nothing and does not flinch, until the frozen thing remembers, of its own slow accord, that it was once alive. She had done it for a starving falcon on a neglected block. She found she could do it for a duke. For his part, Julian Rourke discovered that he had spent 5 years in the company of people who wanted things of him, his money, his name, his forbearance, his hand for their daughters, and not one of them, in all that time, had wanted only his company, and asked for nothing else. Rosalind wanted nothing of him. She had a roof of her own now, and wages of her own, and a front door that locked from the inside, and she made it gently and unmistakably clear that she would take from him no gift that made her again a dependent, no settlement, no fine gowns, no easing of a life she had chosen to make hard and honest and her own. It maddened him, and it healed him, both at once. He had never in his life had to earn a woman's regard. His rank had always bought it before he could spend the effort. Now he found he must come, week upon week, through the cold, and be interesting, and be kind, and be honest, and be patient, and win by inches a thing that could not be commanded. And he understood, somewhere in the long courting of her, that the winning of it was the first real work his soul had done in 5 years, and that a thing earned so is worth 100 things merely owned. There was one afternoon that winter that Rosalind kept, ever after, folded away among the few true treasures of her life. The Duke had come, and the day had turned fair and hard and bright as such northern days sometimes do, and instead of sitting in the parlour they had walked out together onto the fell above the town, the two of them, and no one else, with the cold sun laying long blue shadows across the frozen heather. And there walking, he had told her the rest of it. not the bare fact of Cecily's death, which she already had, but the whole slow grief of it, the 3 days of the fever, and the physician's face, and the spring rain on the churchyard, and the 5 years after in which he had systematically starved every warm thing in himself to death, because warmth was only another word for something that could be lost. He had never told it whole to anyone. He told it to Rosalind on the frozen fell in the blue light, walking, not looking at her, and she walked beside him, and did not once interrupt, and did not once say any of the brisk, foolish, comforting things people say. And when he had finished, she said only, after a while, "Thank you for telling me. It is a great weight, and you have carried it alone, and you did not have to tell me, and I will not set it down carelessly." And Julian Rourke, who had braced himself for pity, and got instead this plain grave courtesy, found his eyes stinging in the cold wind, and understood that he had, somewhere in the last frozen months, begun to love her past all his careful defences, and that the loving of her was not, after all, the danger he had spent 5 years dreading. It was the first safe thing he had felt in the whole of that long winter, safe the way solid ground is safe, under a man who has been drowning without knowing it. The Duke's grandmother came to look her over, in time, as such formidable old women do. She was the Dowager Duchess of Ashcombe, a flint-eyed lady of 70 with a tongue the whole of society feared. And she arrived at the widow's small house in a great coach that took up the whole narrow street, and demanded to see the companion who has done what all the beauties of 3 seasons could not, and thawed my grandson. Rosalind received her plainly dressed, in the grey gown, and did not flatter, and answered the old woman's flint-hard questions straight, and poured her tea without spilling it, though the dowager did everything in her power to fluster her. The old lady looked her up and down a long, piercing while, at the grey gown, at the steady grey eyes, at the calm, ungrasping stillness of her. "They tell me," the dowager said at last, "that you insulted my grandson to his face before a room full of people, and walked out of his creditor's house with your coat over your arm and nowhere on this earth to go." "They tell you correctly, madam," said Rosalind, and the Dowager Duchess of Ashcombe threw back her head and gave a great bark of a laugh that rattled the widow's teacups. "Ha! Good, good," the pretty ones simpered at him, and he froze them out one by one, and I had begun to think he would go to his grave a block of ice and take the whole line with him. And then a grey companion tells him there is nothing in the room worth his trouble, and marches out into the snow, and the fool wakes up at last. "You'll do, girl, you'll do very well indeed. It is always the overlooked ones. It is only that the world is such a fool it takes so long to look." There was a reckoning at Wrenmoor, though not the sort the family had feared, and not one Rosalind sought. The Duke of Ashcombe held the debt still, and could have ruined them at a word, and for a cold week or 2 after that dinner the whole household lived in terror that the insult of the grey cousin's exit would be visited upon them all. But when the Duke's decision came, it was a quiet one, and it bore, though they did not know it, Rosalind's fingerprints all over it, for she had said to him, one evening in the widow's parlour, when he had spoken with some heat of turning Gerald Wrenmoor into the road he deserved, "You must not for my sake. I know too well what it is to be turned out with nothing and no one, and I will not be the cause of it in another soul, not even Gerald, not even the dowager who called me plain as a post over her wine. Let them keep their house and their pride. It costs you little, and it costs me nothing but a grudge I would rather not carry, and a grudge is a heavy thing to haul about a whole life. Let it go." And the Duke of Ashcombe, who had ridden through his 5 cold years believing the world was owed hardness, for the hardness it had dealt him, looked at her a long moment in the firelight, and understood that he had somehow undeservedly come to love a woman better than himself, and that the loving of her was the great unearned mercy of his life. So the debt was not called in. It was instead quietly restructured on terms the Wrenmoors could actually meet, on the single unspoken condition, which the family understood well enough without its ever being said, that a certain grey cousin, wherever she now was never again to be spoken of by any of them with anything but respect. The dowager, who had lost her useful drudge and gained a duke's cold forbearance in exchange, was too relieved to be resentful for long, and if she never quite grasped that she had insulted into a duchess the very girl she had called plain as a post, she was at least clever enough, in the end, to stop telling the story of that dinner at all. Gerald Wrenmoor, his inheritance saved and his schemes come to nothing, went back to London a chastened man, and gambled less, and worked a little. And if he thought of his poor cousin at all, it was with a wary respect he could not have explained. None of them were ruined. Rosalind would not have it. She had walked out of that house with nothing but her coat and herself, and she found she had no wish, now that she had everything, to walk back in and take anything of theirs away. She and the Duke of Ashcombe were married in the spring, a year and a season after the night she walked out, in the small stone church in the market town, and it was not the wedding the county had gossiped over. There was no great society crush, no display, no glittering crowd come to gawk at a duke throwing himself away on a companion. There was a plain grey-eyed bride, in a gown of soft dove grey. She would not be talked out of the grey. It was, she said, the truest thing she owned. And Julian said he would not have her in anything else in the world, for it was in a grey coat over a plain arm that she had walked into and out of his frozen life, and cracked it clean open. There was the kind, half-blind old widow, weeping happily in the front pew at the marriage of the companion who had become a friend. There was the flint-eyed dowager duchess, who pronounced the whole affair the only sensible thing my grandson has done in a decade, and dabbed, when she thought no one saw, at her sharp old eyes. And there was, brought down from Rosalind at Rosalind's particular insistence, and settled now for good in the great mews at Ashcombe, a fierce white gerfalcon that let no one on earth near it save one grey-eyed woman, and that sat that spring morning hooded and calm upon her gloved wrist through the whole of the service, the only creature in the church that had known, from the very first cold morning, exactly what she was worth. Julian asked her once, in the good quiet years that followed, why she had done it, why she had taken her coat and walked out that night, when a wiser and more prudent woman would have swallowed the insult and kept her warm place by the wall. And Rosalind thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything, her hand resting on the head of the great white falcon on its perch. "Because I had been swallowing it for 28 years," she said at last, "and I found that night that I had swallowed the very last of it there was room in me for. You said 100 more of me might be had for the asking, and for one moment I believed you. and it was the worst moment of my life. And then I looked at that bird, that no one can hold and no one can tame, and that would sooner die on its block than pretend to be tame for the comfort of small people, and I thought, there is only one of it in all the world, and it knows its own worth though no one else does, and I would rather be that than be 100 grey days against a wall. So I took my coat. It was the only thing in that house that was truly mine. And I walked out. And it was the first free thing I had done in 5 years, and I would do it again tonight if I had to, though it cost me everything, for it turned out to cost me nothing and win me a whole life. And Julian Rourke, who had once told a room full of people that women like her were common as grey days, looked at his wife, the one grey day in all his cold grey years that had turned out to be the only warm thing in the whole of his life, and understood, as he understood it fresh every morning of the good years they were given, that he had come within one closed door of never knowing her at all. I said the cruelest thing I have ever said, he told her, and it was the making of us both, for it was the one thing cold enough to drive you out, and true enough, once you were gone, to wake me. I do not deserve you, Rosalind. I said as much to my grandmother, and she agreed with me at once, which I thought unkind of her. And then she said no man deserves such a thing, and the fools who think they do are exactly the ones who never get it. I only stood in the frost long enough, that one cold night, to ask, and you came back across the yard. That is the whole of my great good fortune. I stood in the cold, and I asked, and you did not walk away a second time. They were happy, in the way that two guarded, grieving, honest people are happy when they have each, against all their long training, dared at last to be seen, quietly and steadily and more deeply for the years of winter that had come before. The great cold house of Ashcombe learned, room by room, what it was to have the shutters opened and the fires lit, and a mistress who knew every servant's name and asked nothing of anyone that she would not do herself. The Duke laughed now, sometimes, out loud without meaning to, and the old servants who remembered the frozen years would catch one another's eyes at the sound of it and say nothing, for there was nothing that needed saying. And every morning, in every weather, the Duke and Duchess of Ashcombe walked out together to the great mews with the cold, clean moor wind in their faces, and Rosalind would take the fierce white falcon on her gloved wrist and carry it out onto the open fell and cast it up into the grey northern sky and watch it climb, wild and free and utterly itself, and come back down through the cold, bright air to her wrist, and no other in all the world. The one creature that had known her from the first, that had chosen her when she was nothing, that had shown her, on the worst night of her life, exactly what a thing worth 100 grey days looked like, when it refused to pretend to be tame. Years later, when they were both grey themselves, and the great warm house was full of children who had never once heard their mother called plain as a post, a young niece newly come into the family asked the Duchess of Ashcombe, in the wondering way of the young, how it was that she, of all the beauties her husband might have had come to marry a duke. And Rosalind, 28 no longer, took a long quiet moment, and rested her hand on the barred wing of an old white falcon, gone soft and slow with the years, but still always on her wrist, and no others. "I did not marry a duke, child," she said at last. "I insulted one, and I took my coat, and I walked out of his creditor's house into the snow with nowhere on this earth to go. That is the whole of the secret, and it is not much of a secret, and I will give it to you for nothing, which is more than anyone ever gave me. Do not spend your one life being 100 of anything for the comfort of small people. Be the one thing that you are, even when it is cold, even when it costs you the warm room and the safe wall and everyone's good opinion. Take your coat, walk out into the honest cold, and be entirely yourself. For the world will tell you 100 times that you are common as a grey day, and the only answer that has ever been worth making is to turn at the door and tell it plainly there is nothing there worth your trouble, and go. The light was going gold over the moor. Julian came in from the fields with the cold on his coat and stood a moment in the doorway watching his wife with the old falcon on her wrist, as he had watched her cross a frozen yard toward him in the grey dawn a whole lifetime and a whole thaw ago. And the great white bird turned its ancient gold eye to him and did not startle, for it had long since decided he was hers and therefore to be born. Rosalind lifted her steady grey eyes and found him there, and neither of them said anything at all, for there was nothing that needed saying. She had walked out of a warm, false room once into the honest cold, with nothing but a coat and her own 2 feet, and the whole of herself intact, and it had been the truest thing she ever did, and it had cracked 2 frozen lives clean open and let the spring in, and she had never for one day of the long good life that followed been sorry. The falcon had known it first, on a cold grey morning, when a plain woman no one troubled to thank slipped its hood with steady fingers and stood quiet and asked it for nothing, and it turned its fierce gold eye upon her and settled its wings and chose her. And Julian Rourke, Duke of Ashcombe, who had once said he could find 100 like her, and had spent the best years of his life grateful past all speaking, that he had been so completely and so mercifully wrong, breathed out, quiet and steady in the gold and fading light, and thanked God every single day that a grey woman had once taken her coat and told him the truth and walked out, because a warmer, tamer, more obliging woman would only ever have simpered and stayed, and it was the one who walked out, in the end, who had walked back in and given him his whole life.